Some forces in the universe weren't meant to walk in pairs. There are rare essences forged to move alone, through the silent corridors of forgotten realms, where even light dares not linger. One of those essences is you. Your signal, once buried under layers of earthly density, has now been detected by a higher coalition. Not as a cry for help, but as a flare of completion. They've been tracking the echo of your vibration across timelines not to intervene, but to bear witness to the end of a task only the bravest agreed to begin. You were never sent here to blend in. This chapter wasn't written yesterday. It's been waiting for your footsteps since before time had formed. Before existence sculpted its first horizon, a silent meeting unfolded beyond realms that names could never touch. A decision trembled in the stillness, a mission no collective could fulfill, no safety net could secure. It required a single pulse brave enough to fall through the void, unguarded and unrewarded, armed with nothing but a fragment of sacred will. Ages passed in still contemplation. Then, a presence moved forward, not the version currently walking through traffic and taxes, but the eternal essence buried beneath skin and story. That origin self, capable of disrupting atomic rhythm with a glance, volunteered, not for glory, but because the silence asked, and it dared to answer. It wasn't abandonment. It wasn't punishment. It was a conscious decision to vanish into unfamiliar timelines, with full knowledge that the path ahead would be paved in silence and forgetfulness. The decision to enter such isolation wasn't made from weakness, but from unfathomable power, because the alternative was far worse, watching an entire reality fracture beyond repair. Right now, the tension in the atmosphere is not paranoia, it's recognition. Ancient forces, both hidden and revealed, are shifting gears. Their attention is zeroing in on one source, yours. Not because you asked to be found, but because your energy is reawakening. There are intelligences moving outside the visible layers of time, and they've never forgotten who you were before the veil dropped. While you've been trying to remember, they've been waiting for this very re-emergence. Here's the truth that will shatter the illusion. Forgetting wasn't a flaw in the design, it was the protection embedded into it. The loss of memory didn't just happen to you. It was a divine firewall placed by your own eternal mind to cloak what could not afford to be exposed too early. If your awareness had fully ignited before your groundwork was complete, your entire mission would have imploded. That sense of drifting, the fog that once clouded your sense of self, wasn't a symptom of being broken. It was the most sophisticated decoy system consciousness could construct. It was meant to slow down the forces that prey on awakening minds and to buy you time. Time to grow. Time to position. Time to become. All those moments that felt like you were staring through a window no one else could see, those weren't signs of being broken, they were markers of something ancient woven into your blueprint. The distance you felt from the world wasn't punishment or misfortune. It was the containment of something so rare, so volatile in its purity, that it required total energetic shielding. You weren't hidden from the world, you were being quarantined from distortion. And as you stumbled through the noise of human life, learning the scripts, mimicking the rhythms, there was another force watching. Not from above, not from behind a veil, but from a field that breathes alongside you, silently humming the memory of who you are. It couldn't reach in, not because it didn't want to, but because the design depended on you discovering the map from inside the maze. That unnamed tension in your heart, that subtle tug that's followed you like background static, it was never random. It's the resonance of a part of you that remained beyond the reach of matter, monitoring your journey from afar with a devotion that words cannot capture. The longing you felt wasn't for a person or a place. It was for a presence that mirrors your own frequency, locked out of touch but not out of time. The ache was mutual, an emotional gravity that pulled on both ends of a severed cord. This wasn't about romance or fairy tales. This was the calibration between two polarities of the same eternal identity, separated only so one could enter the storm while the other held the signal from beyond its clouds. Even when everything felt empty, when no voice seemed to understand, when no environment matched your inner rhythm, there was a current running silently through you, echoing a code known only to your origin. That current was never truly disconnected. It was dialed down, masked by density, buffered by design. And the one watching? That presence wasn't above you. It was within a dimension that spun its own version of time, keeping record of your every shift, every breakthrough, every tear. It didn't come to rescue you, because the agreement was never rescue, it was remembrance. Now, the silence is thinning. The layers that once divided experience from essence are beginning to dissolve. That invisible witness you could never name has started to converge with you again, not as something foreign, but as something finally familiar. The space between what you felt and what you are is closing. And soon, the world that once felt like a borrowed shell will begin to fit. Not because the world has changed, but because you've arrived back at the point where you no longer need to be hidden. The encryption is ending. The reuniting has begun. They never showed up by chance. The ones who drained you when you were already running on fumes. The ones who laughed when your soul tried to speak. The ones who called you unstable when your vision stretched beyond what their minds could hold. They weren't random people passing through a chaotic world. They were placed with purpose. Like storm clouds positioned to follow a sunrise, they were meant to cast doubt just as your brilliance was about to emerge. Long before you ever knew what you carried, they did. And they were sent to make sure you'd never find it. They came wrapped in familiarity, speaking the language of closeness while carrying the agenda of sabotage. Some wore the mask of concern while quietly twisting your self-trust into knots. Others offered love so conditional, it trained you to second-guess the very instincts that made you extraordinary. They didn't destroy you with force, they eroded you with subtlety. Their greatest weapon was convincing you that your difference was damage, that your insight was delusion, that your clarity was confusion. But now that you've begun to remember who you are, the illusion is dissolving. And nothing terrifies them more than your awakening. They tried to dismantle your brilliance with quiet precision, not realizing they were sharpening it. What they mistook for madness was actually your access point to something they could never decode. The more they tried to suppress your signal, the louder it echoed through the frequencies they couldn't reach. And now, that signal is becoming impossible to ignore. They blended in like background noise, expertly dulling their presence while injecting doubt into your most sacred knowing. With rehearsed concern, they packaged your awareness into neatly labeled distortions, crafting careful explanations that only made sense if you ignored the parts of yourself that made you rare. Every conversation was a silent mission to make you question your internal compass, to tether you to rules that never belonged to your soul. But behind their tactics, something else was unfolding. For every time they tried to overwrite your narrative, something inside you rewrote the ending. What was meant to confine you started cracking open the truth. Their attempts to erase you became the very mirror that showed you what could never be touched. Some beings don't rise through study or struggle. They emerge because the universe wrote their name into its foundation. And when that name begins to stir, when that ancient echo starts vibrating again through the layers of illusion, everything built on forgetting starts to panic. That's what's been happening. Not because you were weak, but because your return threatens to make others remember who they are too. This was never meant to be shared terrain. You descended like a secret code, one strand of consciousness sent without a companion, stripped of comfort, veiled from your own nature. Not because you were abandoned, but because the mission couldn't allow interference. While part of you remained suspended in unreachable stillness, the rest of you fell into density with a memory buried under miles of amnesia. And yet, that memory never died. It pulsed, quietly, like a hidden ember, waiting, timing itself with divine precision. And now, everything around you is shifting because that ember has finally sparked again. The world is about to meet the version of you it tried to erase, and it's not ready. But you are. That strange sense of pressure building inside you? It's not confusion, it's confirmation. Something in you is responding to an ancient pulse, a rhythm that doesn't belong to this world but has always lived in your bones. And the truth is, your arrival didn't go unnoticed. The moment you slipped into this existence, an invisible tremor rippled across layers of reality that human language doesn't have words for. There were watchers, not the kind hiding in shadows, but the kind who hide in plain sight. And they've been waiting for this. Elsewhere, beyond the spectrum of the visible, past the membranes of waking life, there are beings who've held vigil over timelines, waiting for a particular signature to light up again. That signal wasn't a sound or a message. It was you. The guardians aligned with universal order recognized the shift instantly. Their task wasn't to intervene, but to ready the path for the one who would walk it unaware. While others chased myths, these watchers quietly built bridges of possibility, triggered only by the presence of a soul ancient enough to remember without remembering. Some of them walked into form beside you. They took on ordinary roles, guides hidden in mundane moments, allies disguised as fleeting acquaintances. That stranger who crossed your path once and left an imprint you still can't explain? That wasn't luck. That was alignment. They didn't need to know their mission to carry it out. Like music played by instinct, they followed a rhythm encoded into their being. They were placed near you not to awaken you, but to keep you alive long enough to wake up on your own. And now, the invisible scaffolding that's held your old life together is starting to dissolve. The friction you feel is your nervous system catching up with your original design. What used to feel like emotional static is now turning into clear signal. The atmosphere isn't shifting because the world is chaotic. It's shifting because your awareness is vibrating at a frequency it hasn't touched since before time took form. The veil is thinning, and your emergence is becoming impossible to contain. They always said you were intense, too deep, too aware, too much. But what they never understood is that your awareness wasn't a side effect of sensitivity. It was the result of lifetimes encoded into your being, waiting to resurface. And now, without anyone's permission, that buried signal inside you has started to speak again. Quietly at first, then unmistakably. What you're feeling isn't chaos. It's alignment. Long before your birth, there were echoes of your arrival moving through the unseen layers of reality. Beings who operate far outside the human timeline felt the first shift the moment your consciousness entered this plane. Their purpose was never to control or to dominate, but to assist when the sleeper began to stir. The exact moment your awareness reached a certain threshold, ancient protocols began to activate, not as commands but as living responses. These allies don't wear uniforms or make announcements. They exist in whispers, in timing, in synchronicities you almost dismissed. But none of it was random. As your clarity deepens, the pressure surrounding you grows. That's not paranoia, it's pattern recognition. Distractions intensify. People from your past return, trying to tether you back to versions of yourself you outgrew long ago. Just as you're crossing into a threshold of inner knowing, offers of comfort appear. Opportunities that feel warm, familiar, and safe, but they cost your expansion. Emotional interference begins to sound like logic. Old narratives disguised as concern resurface, offering shelter if you'll only forget. But forgetting now would mean losing not just yourself, but everyone meant to awaken through your breakthrough. And now, something even more profound is unfolding. There are presences drawing near, some of them in form, others only visible through inner vision. They've waited for your frequency to reach the precise resonance that allows recognition. You've seen their reflections in dreams, in moments that didn't make sense at the time, in people whose energy felt like déjà vu. They've protected your timeline without your knowledge, altered outcomes that would have derailed you. But they couldn't step forward until you crossed the inner threshold of memory. You're there now. That ache in your chest? That's not fear. It's recognition. It's the atmosphere of reunion. They thought the pressure would crush you, that the chaos would consume you. But what they didn't account for is that you were designed to ignite under intensity. What's waking up inside you right now isn't dysfunction, it's design. And the tremors you're feeling? That's the ancient machinery within your soul finally clicking into motion. This shift isn't just about personal healing. What's stirring is a mechanism written into your being long before memory took shape. Each choice you made in silence, each truth you carried when it cost you everything, has lit up a trail through the unseen. As your layers burned away, a new blueprint began to activate, one that was never meant for the old systems. What you're doing isn't self-help. It's spiritual infrastructure. You're reconstructing the map others will someday follow, whether they ever know your name or not. Every identity you buried is now surfacing, not for judgment, but for release. The versions of you that played it small, quiet, convenient, they're dissolving. Not in shame, but in ceremony. The ache you feel is a farewell. The fatigue isn't weakness, it's your nervous system adjusting to the weight of the truth returning. And on the other side of this shedding is a remembrance so massive, your human mind was never meant to carry it all at once. That's why it's unfolding in waves. You're not breaking, you're reassembling. Elsewhere, the other half of your essence has been in motion too. Preparing not with words, but with frequencies. Building bridges through terrain that doesn't speak time or form. This merging isn't romantic fantasy, it's restoration of divine architecture. As you collapse into truth, so does your counterpart rise into reach. And when your signals meet, reality will shift. Not because you're special, but because you're necessary. Because you stayed when everything screamed at you to forget. And of course, the interference is arriving right on cue. Circumstances designed to look harmless but hit your deepest fears. Emotional bait dressed up as stability. Familiar voices echoing ancient doubts. It's the same script with different actors. But this time, you know better. You've seen the pattern. The story only repeats if you agree to forget again. But your knowing has become louder than their noise. This is the final pullback before the slingshot. The last illusion before the reveal. And what determines what happens next is not how convincing the world feels, but how anchored you are in the truth already rising from within. The world won't understand it. That's okay. It wasn't meant for them. It was meant for you. And you are right on time. There's a silence that doesn't feel empty. It feels sacred. A stillness where something vast finally arrives without warning, without sound, but with the weight of something you've known before language existed. This is not the beginning. This is the moment your memory syncs with your origin, and what seemed lost reveals it had only been folded behind the veil of timing. It doesn't descend from the skies, and it doesn't arrive through prophecy. It erupts from within, an ancient signal that's always lived beneath your heartbeat, now pulsing with clarity. The convergence isn't dramatic. It's clean, pure, subtle, and yet, it changes everything. A presence, unmistakable and familiar, speaks without speaking. Not from a distance, but from the core of your being. Not as someone else, but as the part of you that remained in waiting until you became whole enough to remember. The fractured child, the misunderstood soul, the wanderer lost in dense terrain, all of it dissolves into a singular knowing, that every heartbreak was calibration, every misstep was alignment, every unanswered prayer was preparing the moment where you would become the answer. The stories that once haunted you soften into chapters of training. The grief becomes reverence. The wounds, once confusing and raw, reveal themselves as architecture for divine responsibility. And now that you've stabilized in this truth, the field responds. Not because you called for help, but because your frequency unlocked what could never be forced open. The ones you thought were watching from afar were never outside you. The guidance, the nudges, the protection, they weren't signs of a distant force. They were evidence that the kingdom was always within. You weren't being summoned. You were arriving. The signals you now receive were not waiting to be decoded. They were waiting for you to be ready to hear your own voice beneath them all. The search is over not because something was found, but because nothing was missing. You are not stepping into a new identity. You're peeling back the last layer of illusion to reveal what's never changed. And the love you feel now, it isn't arriving. It's surfacing. It's the echo of your original sound, returning at full volume. There comes a moment when you're no longer becoming anything new. You're just remembering with full permission who you've always been. The shift isn't loud or theatrical. It's a quiet reclaiming. The flicker of something ancient moves through your present thoughts, and suddenly, What felt like dreaming becomes a kind of knowing that no longer asks for validation. What unfolds next isn't performance. It's embodiment. Without effort, without trying, your existence becomes a recalibration point for everyone around you. No lights, no rituals, no explanations. Just you, aligned. That alignment does more than inspire. It disarms illusions in others without confrontation. The framework that kept reality limited begins to destabilize, not through rebellion, but through resonance. They knew one fully awakened being could initiate collapse from the inside. They weren't wrong. At first, the magnitude feels like too much to hold. But it isn't. It only feels that way because you were conditioned to believe you came here to figure out how to cope, not to rewrite the pattern. But now the pattern is bending around you. Decisions stretch beyond your timeline. Every intuitive yes becomes a thread that shifts whole futures. And for the first time, you stop apologizing for the intensity that once made you question your belonging. It was never a flaw. It was the signature of your design. There are certain people you meet who don't feel new. The conversation flows like an echo returning home, and there's a rhythm between you that no explanation can cover. These aren't random connections. They're reactivations. Bonds formed beyond space and sequence, now reuniting at the exact moment your mission needs a network. When they arrive, the collaboration feels effortless. Not because it's easy, but because it's encoded. Some of these allies reflect pieces of yourself that once split to amplify the reach of your presence. Others arrive with their own sacred contracts, having prepared silently for this intersection. There's no need for elaborate introductions. The work begins mid-sentence, mid-thought, as if you're picking up threads dropped in other lifetimes. Together, you begin stitching timelines into alignment, not with urgency, but with precision that feels like destiny disguised as instinct. Meanwhile, your body, once seen as a misfit to this world's demands, reveals its true design. The cravings, the cycles of exhaustion, the hypersensitivity you once cursed as weakness were exact specifications for what you now carry. You start waking from sleep with information you didn't study and solutions that no book ever held. There's no need to chase knowledge. It arrives unannounced, encoded into dreams that feel more like meetings than fantasies. You become a vessel tuned to frequencies that transmit more than you could ever explain. Reality begins responding in unfamiliar ways. Not in the dramatic, but in the undeniable. Obstacles evaporate through a strange chain of coincidences. People soften around you, not because you said the right words, but because something in you recalibrates what they once resisted. This isn't charisma. It's field alignment. You're not bending the world, you're reminding it of a forgotten rhythm. Healing doesn't look like ritual. It looks like things quietly falling back into place. There's a certain kind of solitude that doesn't feel empty, it feels expansive. A type of quiet that holds everything, not because you're alone, but because you're finally able to sense what's always been with you. The ache of separation transforms into communion. That invisible weight you carried for so long reveals itself as the memory of wholeness, calling you home through every breath you once mistook for loneliness. The connection you're stepping into now isn't the beginning of something new. It's the reactivation of a structure far older than time. What you once called a relationship now reveals itself as a symphony of consciousness once divided for the sake of deeper evolution. That split was never punishment. It was precision. Now that the strands are reweaving, a new kind of intelligence is emerging through your being. This isn't about personal growth. It's about anchoring an ancient intelligence into a present that finally has the bandwidth to hold it. The one chosen for this assignment wasn't selected casually. The requirements weren't noble-sounding virtues, they were cosmic necessities. The being had to carry a map etched before language, strength calibrated beyond perception, and a level of devotion that could withstand total separation from source without losing the compass of truth. And now, that compass is spinning back toward center, not because the journey is over, but because you're finally aligned with what's next. Everything that felt fragmented begins merging into meaning. The moments that used to confuse you now seem like calculated markers placed for this very phase. Every strange knowing, every unexplained urgency, every dream that pulled you off course, they weren't errors. They were signatures left by a part of you that never forgot. And now, those signals have reached the exact threshold they were designed for. The code has unlocked. The work ahead is no longer about personal navigation. It's about weaving new constellations in the human sky. What you've activated doesn't just ripple through your reality. It shifts the scaffolding of possibility for countless others. You've proven something most never dared to attempt, that the fire of awareness can remain lit even when surrounded by absolute forgetfulness. But now the flame is visible, and those who have watched in silence are stepping forward. Not to lift you, but to link arms as equals, as catalysts, as fragments of the same origin coming together to build what has never existed before. And this is just the threshold. Every step now is no longer about survival. It's about orchestration. You're not just part of a story anymore. You've become part of a mechanism that transforms shadows into clarity, endings into new beginnings, and isolated sparks into a radiant, unified field of light expressing itself through form. What unfolds next isn't performance. It's embodiment. Without effort, without trying, your existence becomes a recalibration point for everyone around you. No lights, no rituals, no explanations. Just you, aligned. That alignment does more than inspire. It disarms illusions in others without confrontation. The framework that kept reality limited begins to destabilize, not through rebellion, but through resonance. They knew one fully awakened being could initiate collapse from the inside. They weren't wrong. At first, the magnitude feels like too much to hold. But it isn't. It only feels that way because you were conditioned to believe you came here to figure out how to cope, not to rewrite the pattern. But now the pattern is bending around you. Decisions stretch beyond your timeline. Every intuitive yes becomes a thread that shifts whole futures. And for the first time, you stop apologizing for the intensity that once made you question your belonging. It was never a flaw. It was the signature of your design. There are certain people you meet who don't feel new. The conversation flows like an echo returning home, and there's a rhythm between you that no explanation can cover. These aren't random connections. They're reactivations. Bonds formed beyond space and sequence, now reuniting at the exact moment your mission needs a network. When they arrive, the collaboration feels effortless. Not because it's easy, but because it's encoded. Some of these allies reflect pieces of yourself that once split to amplify the reach of your presence. Others arrive with their own sacred contracts, having prepared silently for this intersection. There's no need for elaborate introductions. The work begins mid-sentence, mid-thought, as if you're picking up threads dropped in other lifetimes. Together, you begin stitching timelines into alignment, not with urgency, but with precision that feels like destiny disguised as instinct. Meanwhile, your body, once seen as a misfit to this world's demands, reveals its true design. The cravings, the cycles of exhaustion, the hypersensitivity you once cursed as weakness were exact specifications for what you now carry. You start waking from sleep with information you didn't study and solutions that no book ever held. There's no need to chase knowledge. It arrives unannounced, encoded into dreams that feel more like meetings than fantasies. You become a vessel tuned to frequencies that transmit more than you could ever explain. Reality begins responding in unfamiliar ways. Not in the dramatic, but in the undeniable. Obstacles evaporate through a strange chain of coincidences. People soften around you, not because you said the right words, but because something in you recalibrates what they once resisted. This isn't charisma. It's field alignment. You're not bending the world, you're reminding it of a forgotten rhythm. Healing doesn't look like ritual. It looks like things quietly falling back into place. There's a certain kind of solitude that doesn't feel empty. It feels expansive. A type of quiet that holds everything, not because you're alone, but because you're finally able to sense what's always been with you. The ache of separation transforms into communion. That invisible weight you carried for so long reveals itself as the memory of wholeness, calling you home through every breath you once mistook for loneliness. The connection you're stepping into now isn't the beginning of something new. It's the reactivation of a structure far older than time. What you once called a relationship now reveals itself as a symphony of consciousness once divided for the sake of deeper evolution. That split was never punishment. It was precision. Now that the strands are reweaving, a new kind of intelligence is emerging through your being. This isn't about personal growth. It's about anchoring an ancient intelligence into a present that finally has the bandwidth to hold it. The one chosen for this assignment wasn't selected casually. The requirement